Hello LEGO Fortnite creators and welcome to my channel. Are you tired of those pesky snap directions cramping your style? Well, today I'm unleashing a game-changing exploit I discovered that will have you building like a boss. So get ready because we're diving into the art of directional building. By the end of this video, you'll know how to build in any direction so you can craft jaw-dropping structures that seamlessly blend into the landscape and monorails that actually go where you want them to. With a little bit of practice, you'll be turning your epic villages into legendary villages, maybe even mythic. And stick around as I'll show you some tips and tricks that'll make your directional building even easier. The secret weapon for directional building is the dynamic platform and the snap mode nudge building feature. Flat locations like this one are best when you're setting up your build direction, but fear not cliffhangers, I'll show you some tips and tricks to build on a hillside and a cliff later on. Let's build a replica of the log shed, and we'll do it on a 45-degree angle. I'm going to start with a 16 by 16 by 2 foundation block, which we'll use to establish our 45-degree angle. Next, we need to set a couple pillars that we'll use as the backstop for the dynamic platform. You can use any pillar or post. My favorite is the palatial pillar, so I'll select that one. To set our 45-degree backstop, let's snap the first pillar on one corner of the foundation and the second pillar on the opposite corner, making sure they're both on the same side of the center line. Then I'll do a quick eyeball check just to make sure the pillars are lined up and then we can see both corners of the foundation. Now that our pillars are in the correct place, we can give the foundation a smack with the pickaxe to get it out of the way. We'll lay down a couple of dynamic platforms next. Make sure the first one sticks out past the first pillar, and then snap a second platform to the first one so it's long enough to span between both pillars. Now that the dynamic platform is built, we need to get it on a 45-degree angle. So let's push them up against the pillars, being careful not to overshoot. Once the platform is up against the pillars, give it a good push, make sure there are no gaps. Then do a double check to make sure that they're touching on both pillars. To set our first directional piece, we'll need to elevate the platform up so we can snap underneath it. A couple small foundation blocks on top of the dynamic platform, and then any type of flooring will work. Just stick it on top and make sure that it hangs out over the side of the platform. Now that we can see the bottom side of the flooring, you may need to duck down to get the crosshair on the plank. You'll grab the palatial pillar again. Once you see the pillar snap under the bottom of the flooring and it's halfway into the ground, you'll use the nudge feature to move it out from underneath the dynamic platform. No part of the pillar must be touching any part of the dynamic platform. I'll set a second pillar just as an example of what happens when you don't separate the pillar from the platform. And just like magic, you have built your very first directional piece. Your LEGO villages are about to level up. Let's give this pillar a push so you can see it's solid in the ground. Let's check out the piece I left snapped underneath the platform. Even though it's halfway in the ground, it can still be pushed around because it's part of the dynamic platform. It's critical that you nudge your pillar out and away from the platform. We don't need the dynamic platform anymore, so I'll give that a whack and get it out of the way. And we don't need the backstop pillars either, so a couple more whacks, and now we have a nice clean workspace. Now that we have our first directional block, let's unlock its potential. With the foundation block selected, you can see that when the crosshair is on the ground, the block snaps to the world direction. But when the crosshair is on the pillar, it changes to 45 degrees. Every time the cursor moves off or on the pillar, it will determine which direction the block wants to snap. To get this piece to stick to the ground, I'll move the crosshair as low as possible on the pillar towards the ground until hopefully I see it go from that red outline to the green one. But you can see it's not changing to the green, and when the crosshair goes too low, the block will snap back to the world direction. We could snap the foundation to the pillar, but if we do that, then the pillar will be the only thing attaching the building to the ground, and if it gets destroyed, the entire building will become a dynamic platform. It's not ideal. So it's best that we secure the foundation to the ground like a normal building. To do this, we need to get the foundation lower into the ground, so we're going to have to move our pillar closer to the crest of the hill. There are a few ways to do this. The first is to use another palatial pillar and use the snap mode, and we'll nudge it over 16 studs at a time. This is alright if you're close to a hillside, but if you have to go farther distance, it's very slow. The second way is to use a 16 stud long piece of flooring. We attach it to the pillar, and then we use the snap mode to keep adding pieces until we reach the edge of the hill. Once you've reached the hill, get another pillar and snap it underneath so it's sticking into the ground in the location that is lower than the flat area we'll be building on. We no longer need any of the flooring or the pillars that we used to move over, so I'll clean all those up and I'll leave the very first pillar in place, just as a backup in case we make a mistake and destroy the new pillar. That way we don't have to start all over again. I will use the 16 by 16 foundation again, and I'll place the crosshair on the pillar. The foundation will now turn to the 45 degrees, and you can see that it now has the green boundary, so you can snap it into the ground. And if you move the crosshair up and down the pillar, you'll be able to get the desired depth into the ground. In this case, I'm going to snap it about the same depth as the other prefab cabins. One of the limitations of directional building is that you always have to build off another block in the same direction. Since I could only nudge the first foundation over 16 spaces from the pillar, I'll need to snap another foundation block to the first one and nudge it over to where I want to start the build. With the first foundation block set, the rest of the build is simple, since every piece will now be snapping to one of the other blocks on the cabin. I'll speed up the rest of the cabin build as this is the same as you would build any other structure. Unfortunately, another limitation of directional building is that the prefabs will not work. They'll only snap to the world direction. Even if you select a prefab and place the crosshair on the pillar, it will still align to the world. So for this cabin, I'll just build it from memory as it's pretty simple. If you do want to copy a prefab build, you can start a prefab next to where you want the directional build to be, and then build one section of the prefab, and then the same section on the directional build. All of the pieces you just used will be in your favorites menu, so it's pretty easy. The downside is that it takes longer because you're building more, and you'll temporarily need double the resources for 2 builds, and then you need to destroy the prefab if you don't want it anymore. For directional builds, I find the custom structures are better, and they add some character to the village without the hassle of building twice. And that is it. We just completed a custom built cabin that is in a 45-degree angle from all of the other buildings in your world. Now, let's cover some of the tips that will help you on your directional builds. Let's take a look at building on a hill first. The principle is the same, but first you want to build a solid foundation to work from since you don't have a flat location. In this example, I want to build to the contour of the hill. I'll place the pillars so they line up where the grass meets the platform. If you don't have enough room, you may need to extend your foundation. Then, we drop the dynamic foundations down, push them up against the pillars, do the double check, make sure they're touching. An advantage of working on a hillside is you don't need to build up and duck underneath to spot the pillar. You can just nudge it over until the pillar is in the hill and highlight it green. If you need to move sideways, it's the same principle as you build on the flat. But if you need to move down the hill, just extend out with a couple pieces of flooring and snap some pillars underneath until you're solid in the ground again. Let's take a look at building on a cliff and using a custom dynamic foundation. The same as with the hillside, you'll need to start on a flat base to work from. For this example, I'm going to make the dynamic platform out of foundation blocks rather than the normal dynamic foundation. This can be useful if you don't have any flexwood or if you have limited space to work in. Since a cliff is steep enough that the dynamic foundation won't push up the side of the hill, I won't set any pillars. We'll just use the cliff itself as a backstop. Once you push the foundation up against the cliff, check it's at the angle that you want. And this time, instead of a pillar, I'm just going to use another foundation block by placing it on the custom dynamic foundation and nudging it over until it's embedded in the cliff and highlighted green. Then you can start your build directly on top of the foundation. You may want to have walls that are oriented to the world direction alongside your walls that are oriented in your new custom direction. You can place them close to each other, but because they're not on the same axis, they won't snap together. On inside corners, you can usually get them close enough to each other that they look good, but on outside corners, you'll always end up with a bit of a gap, which can look a little messy. You can use pillars or other objects to try and fill up the gaps and make them look alright from a distance, but when you get closer, it's pretty hard to cover up the spaces and overlaps. If you want to stack pieces on top of each other that are aligned in different directions, you may notice that the block will get the green boundary, indicating that it does have a supporting piece. Unfortunately, as soon as you snap it in place, the block will crumble apart because the two pieces are not oriented in the same direction. A way to get around this is by using a cliff face or the ground to provide the anchor point. If you're on a flat location, you'll need to plan your build so there are anchor points for the different directions you're building in. It won't turn out looking as clean as a normal build, but if you plan your overlaps correctly, it'll look fairly good and resemble a small step up or down. With the introduction of vehicles, you may not use the monorail as much, but I still find they are more reliable and faster when traveling between my primary villages, especially now that you can set the rockets on different channels. If you want to create a monorail in a custom direction, you need to make sure that the angle is bang on. A small error in direction on one end could be a big miss on the other end. A tip for lining up your monorail is to set the marker on the location where you want your monorail to end. And keep in mind you can only build about 1,000 meters in LEGO Fortnite, and then the game won't allow you to snap pieces together anymore. Once you have your marker down, eyeball up a couple pillars so they're in line with the marker. Then snap a couple dynamic foundations together and push them up against the pillars so they're roughly aligned with the direction you want to build. Then I snap a foundation block down and place a piece of flooring on top of the foundation. I like to use the rustic thin floor because it has a small groove down the center for aiming. It's best to use a telescope to look down the board and see if the direction is aligned with the marker. If you don't have a telescope, you can just eyeball along the edge of the flooring. If the dynamic foundation is not aligned with the marker, then set a couple additional pillars slightly to the side and push the dynamic foundation over a little bit. Keep checking and adjusting until the center line of the flooring lines up with the center of the marker. This can be a bit tedious, but a little extra time now will save you a bunch of work later on. Once the alignment is where you want it, you can set your directional block just like you would normally and start building your monorail. For the engineers out there that want more precise angles, I worked out a few of the most reasonable pillar placements for a few common angles. We already covered the easy one, 45 degrees, using a 16 stud by 16 stud foundation, but you can use any square block as long as it has equal sides. For those other angles, there's no exact match without placing the pillars hundreds of meters apart, but there are some measurements that will get you close. For 30 degrees, the pillars will be placed 19 studs long by 11 studs wide. For 22.5 degrees, the pillars will be 12 studs long by 5 studs wide, and for 15 degrees, your pillars will be placed 15 studs long and 4 studs wide. And that's the basics of directional building. I haven't seen anybody building like this yet, so I'm super excited to see what all of you will create. If you can share this video with your friends and then tag me in your posts, that way I can get some inspiration for my future builds. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you want to see any walkthroughs of my villages or what kind of tutorial you want to see in the future. If you made it this far, a like and subscribe would be highly appreciated. Thanks a lot for watching and have fun building.